Welcome back to our penultimate class here in the Introduction to Banking. Last time we talked and we stopped with a small summary of what has happened in banking and financial supervision, especially in the European Union. Now in the European Union, we always have small and minor changes to financial and banking supervision, but when it comes to the regulation of the whole financial system, it is safe to say that the major landmarks were Basel I, Basel II, even more dramatically, Basel II, Basel III, Solvency I, and especially Solvency II in the insurance sector. And some other things that have happened, for example, EMIR, European Markets Infrastructure Regulation, and MiFID, and some other parts of the regulation of the financial sector. Usually it's about capital requirements for banks or insurance companies, or it's about customer protection against banks or more generally financial institutions trying to scam investors and retail customers. So here you can see some guidelines in the European community, later on in the European Union. Most importantly, the big bang in European unified banking regulation has been Basel II. Basel II, named after the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, which is a committee that is located where? Well, obviously Basel, but what institution is located in Basel? The Bank for International Settlements, the central bank of central banks. The equivalent of the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision for Insurance is what? It's an organization or an institution that is also part of the BIS. It's, does anyone know? The IAIS, the International Association of Insurance Supervisors. The IAIS does something very similar to what the Basel Committee does in banking. And we'll come back to this later. Does anyone know what well, not the equivalent, but what organization do we have in the United States? Ever heard of that one? We'll talk more about banking regulation in the US later on, but with insurance supervision, it's just one organization, and that's the NAIC, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. Because I'm talking about this already, let's just wait for the contents of the slide. In the United States, insurance supervision is very simple. Insurance supervision is a matter for the states, and it's not done federally. When we talk about the United States banking and financial supervision, it's always a question what the federal state does, the federal government, and what the individual US states do. In insurance, it's very simple. It's always the states. Basically nothing is done at the federal level, but obviously you need some coordination between the different states, and this coordination is done at the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, but they don't have, I don't think they have any rights. It's basically a committee where the state level insurance commissioners meet and they discuss standardized rules which the states can implement but don't have to. So insurance supervision in the US, it's purely at the state level. Different for banking and stock markets, but we'll come to that. So in 2004, we unified and we standardized banking regulation in the European Union by implementing Basel II. More generally, also it was done at the BIS and the Basel Committee. And at the very heart of Basel II lies capital requirements. Again, in banking regulation, it's all about capital, and always more. Regulators want to make sure that banks have enough capital, that they have capital adequacy is given. So if in doubt, increase capital requirements. It's simple rule of banking regulation. You do have some other regulations, of course, but usually capital is the most important thing. Then we have the financial crisis, the run on repo. Remember that the financial crisis did not see widespread bank runs by customers. It did see, at least in the United States, it did see a run on repo, a run of banks on repurchase agreements in the interbank market where banks lend money to other banks short term. And how do you do this? By using repurchase agreements. And these repurchase agreements, these repos, in German Wertpapierleihgeschäfte, they are simple instruments with which you use securities as a collateral and you get short-term liquidity. Now, banks thought this would always be available at small cost. So if you don't have liquidity, don't worry, you will always get you can always get liquidity from other banks via repo business and repo transactions. At that time, during the financial crisis, the repo market dried up, liquidity dried up, and suddenly banks had no liquidity. And they needed liquidity because they were facing write-offs on their subprime mortgage portfolios. That was the run on repo, not the classical traditional bank run. And far-reaching consequences and changes in the banking regulation around the world followed, with a revision of the Basel Accord and what we now refer to as Basel III, or sometimes even Basel IV now. Main approach is always stricter requirements on liability quality of equity components, additional capital buffers, risk-intensive equity backing to limit debts, liquidity risk limitation by provisions on the holding of liquid funds and by limiting maturity transformation. That's the core of any bank regulation. Make sure that the bank is always liquid, because liquidity is short-term potential for problems. And then make sure that in the mid and long term they have enough capital to survive losses. And how do you do this? Enough capital on the liability side, not too much risk on the asset side. So you need to have a system in place that calculates risk weights on the asset side, that is keeping risk taking in check, and on the liability side, having rules in place with which you can calculate the risk capital or regulatory capital the bank has. And by shifting these regulations and by changing these rules, you can have banks keep more or less capital. Then, over-the-counter derivatives were found during the financial crisis to be one driver of systemic risk. Why? The nature of OTC contracts is that you are looking for a contract partner without the help, usually without the help of an exchange, and you're looking for a business partner yourself, maybe via an electronic trading platform, but the trade is executed just between the two counterparties. So even in a non-electronic world, no one would notice this trade. If I'm Deutsche Bank, you're Commerzbank, I can take up the phone, I can call the traders at Commerzbank, and we can do an OTC trade, and no one notices this. However, we are suddenly interconnected via this trade. So if anything goes wrong at my end, you might suffer because of this OTC trade. This is what regulators found out during the financial crisis, that there was a lot of business, a lot of trades going on in the OTC realm they weren't aware of. And if this is done at in such a dimension that it might pose a systemic risk, regulators should be aware of this. So what has been done? EMIR, the European Market Infrastructure Regulation, it proposes a clearing obligation for standardized OTC derivatives and a reporting obligation for transactions in OTC derivatives, meaning that now they have a central counterparty, and OTC trades in derivatives, if they are standardized, resemble somewhat a derivatives trade over a traditional, not a stock exchange, a traditional futures exchange. Why? Because then you keep track of all those trades at the central counterparty, and if this is done with a central counterparty, it might even be that these trades are guaranteed and you can minimize counterparty risk. Can anyone think of a downside of EMIR regulation? Very, very simple one. If you go to the energy sector in Germany, you probably know that energy companies. Let me outline to you the core of energy and electricity business in Germany. You are a local producer of energy, Stadtwerk. You have a power plant, hopefully not in coal. You have a power plant, you produce electricity. That is, you buy long-term coal, for example, or gas, usually from Russia. Those are long-term contracts and your prices are relatively stable. You produce energy and you sell energy. Now, with energy and electricity, it works like this. We have a system, a very complex system in place that you supply electricity into the grid, and you have to supply the control of the grid with basically a long-term schedule, telling the grid operator, I'm planning on inserting this or that amount of electricity at these points in time. Then you're done, but any deviation from this schedule has to be compensated in short-term trading. And this is why sometimes you hear that producers have to pay extra to sell electricity. Because if they produce too much, if they produce too little, and they have given the grid operator the notice of their long-term schedule, and they're deviating from that schedule, they have to buy or sell the excess amounts of electricity. Where? Does anyone know? Here, at the EEX. The EEX, the European Energy Exchange, is a place where you trade more or less in short-term electricity, energy, etc. So here in Leipzig, we have several small energy trading companies that do the trading for those large suppliers. Some energy suppliers do the trading themselves. So they operate the power plant, but they also have a trading section, a trading division, that is responsible for smoothing out the ups and downs in excess electricity. So if you do your business right, you know when to produce electricity, you produce the right amount, and you forecast these amounts correctly to make a profit. And you have a good trading division that, especially with renewable energy, which cannot be perfectly forecasted, with renewable energy, you have a trading division that is able to minimize risk, or at least to limit the losses you incur from having to sell off or buy excess electricity short term. Why is this done? Because the net regulator and the grid operators have to make sure that the grid always has enough electricity, but doesn't overload. Operators and electricity producers, the plant operators, should not be allowed to insert any amount of electricity into the grid, otherwise it would overload. And if they have too little, if they have scheduled an amount A of electricity and suddenly they produce less, they should be punished for the fact that now someone else has to insert electricity so that we can keep our fridge running. This is in a nutshell how the electricity system in Europe works. Now, why am I telling you this? For a small energy company like a local Stadtwerk, a communal energy supplier, you produce energy, you buy and sell gas, oil, electricity, okay, long term, and you have to smooth out those excess amounts short term. As soon as you have one derivative in your trading business, that is, if you do the electricity trading yourself, you fall under EMIR regulation. And this is something most of the small local companies avoid, like the devil avoids holy water. Those small companies, they fear to fall under EMIR regulation because this would mean financial supervision by BaFin. So if you're a local communal energy supplier, it is likely that you operate your own plant, you sell electricity to retail customers, but you engage with trading companies like a small couple of firms we have here in Leipzig that do the trading on the EEX for you instead of you doing it yourself, because this would mean you fall under EMIR regulation. So if you ask the risk manager of a local communal power plant operator, it's usually that they will say, yes, we do trading, we engage in energy trading, and we have a couple of people working on that, or they will say, no, never ever. That's a cost of regulation. Regulation is tough when you deal in financial derivatives, and this is a consequence of EMIR regulation. Another lesson learned from the financial market crisis is that bankruptcy law was not suitable for large banks. So what is the result? Settlement program for large banks to avoid losses to third parties, the adoption of a Banking Restructuring Act, and the supplement of the Bank Recovery and Resolution Directive. This is what we usually call the European Banking Union. The European Banking Union, in German die Europäische Bankenunion, that's not a union of banks, but what is it? It sounds like the United Federation of Planets, but it is something quite different. It's not an association of banks, what is meant by the EU Banking Union. It is the idea that in the European Union we should have a level playing ground and a unified framework for regulation. Any idea what pillars the European Banking Union entails? If you have a computer open, you could have looked it up on Wikipedia by now. What are the pillars of the European Banking Union? The SSM, the Single Supervisory Mechanism, and the European Banking Authority, meaning, first of all, unified, standardized supervision. Second pillar, resolution. If a bank is in trouble, it needs to have a living will, and there needs to be a unified framework within the European Union in place so that troubled banks and banks closing in on bankruptcy can be resolved and can be put to sleep quietly, so that they can go bankrupt, but it doesn't affect the whole financial system. And the final pillar, which Germany quite dramatically and openly has successfully prevented from happening. Special thanks to Germany, and from Germany with love, especially to Greece. It's a unified deposit insurance scheme. So ideally, the European Banking Union would entail a single supervisory mechanism, which we have. So the same supervision across the European Union. The second one, that's the resolution, living wills for all the large major banks, so that if a bank within the European Union fails, there are the same rules that apply to all banks in all European Union countries, so that they will be resolved and dismantled. And ideally, we would have one European Union deposit insurance scheme, meaning that German depositors would also pay into the same deposit insurance schemes for Greek depositors. And now you know why German politicians have successfully prevented this, because they're afraid that populist movements will exploit this and argue that we German depositors have to pay for the lazy Greek politicians and bankers, and that Greek banks are saved by German deposits. You know, this is the populism that has prevented us from installing a joint union-wide European deposit insurance scheme. Yeah, that's a banking union. Did I understand correctly? Yes. Uniform rules. That is also usually referred to as the single rule book. It doesn't mean that there is one single rule in the book. It means that you have one book that installs the same rules everywhere within the European Union. And the objective is to separate bank crisis, financial crisis, and the public debt crisis. Arguably, we've survived the financial crisis and the public debt crisis by now, but let's be honest, they can come back at any time. And greatest result, ongoing banking supervision. The ECB under the SSM, the single supervisory mechanism, and the CRR as a uniform set of rules. What is the CRR? And CRD4. Those are the names of the European Union derivatives and rules and regulations concerning capital requirements under Basel III, and sometimes we refer to it already as Basel IV. CRR are, if I'm not very much mistaken, capital requirements regulation, and CRD4 is the Capital Requirements Directive 4. Those are the names of the EU directives that form Basel III and Basel IV. Okay. Deposit protection with a common fund is not yet installed, and it looks like it never will be. Okay. That's the historical development of the regulatory framework in the European Union. Let's talk a little bit more about leverage ratio. Now, we've seen the basic finding: banks get in trouble if they have overhang debt, if they have too much leverage. So if you take Deutsche Bank as an example, in 1995 they had 3.9% balance sheet equity ratio. Before the financial crisis, at the start of the financial crisis, they had just 1.9%. In banking, this is considered to be okay. In any other industry, this is ridiculously low. Yes, it is natural for banks to have low equity ratios. This is natural to their business, but the question is whether this is optimally low or if it should be higher, especially in the case of a financial crisis. If you compare it to the regulatory equity ratio, it was 8.6%. And at that time, that was enough, considered enough. They were required to have 8%, they had 8.6%, so everything was peachy. Deutsche Bank didn't have that kind of problems during the financial crisis. Why? Because they cheated a lot and they had to pay enormous legal fees and legal fines afterwards So one can argue that, well, they did survive the financial crisis, but at a horrendous cost 10 years later. Now, the high leverage of the financial sector at that time was definitely at the core of the financial crisis. So the result was that in Basel III, a debt ratio, or more generally a leverage ratio, was introduced as a risk-sensitive capital requirement. The leverage ratio provides additional security with regard to model risk. And this leverage ratio is a lower limit, so it's meant to be a backstop for own funds requirements resulting from the risk-sensitive capital regulations. So what happens in the capital requirements regulation in CRR? The leverage ratio is defined as the quotient of core capital and the sum of all risk positions, Article 429 of the CRR. So core capital divided by overall risk positions, that's the leverage ratio. And what risk positions do you have to include? Balance sheet items, positions in derivatives, other off-balance sheet transactions, because there might also be some risk stemming from some things happening off balance sheet, and repo transactions and other securities financing transactions. Well, we've learned a little bit from the financial crisis. And by 2016, the European Banking Authority shall prepare a report on the effects and effectiveness of a debt ratio and comment on an appropriate level of the debt ratio. Balance sheet assets stated at their carrying amount after individual value adjustments have been taken into account. Credits may not be offset against deposits. So if you've given out loans, they should be included. Assets deducted from core capital are not included. Derivatives are accounted for using the market valuation method, that is at fair value. And then values which are set for risk positions in the leverage ratio start directly with balance sheet values. Capital requirement arising from observance of the leverage ratio essentially depends on accounting regulations. So resulting danger are different accounting rules, IFRS, US GAAP. Under US GAAP, you can net and offset derivatives positions with the positions you are using the derivatives to hedge. That's not possible under IFRS. So depending on the accounting rules, the balance sheet total can vary considerably. Now, I cannot give you the full picture of the CRR. That would mean give you a full semester lecture on this. If you're interested in this, come to the guest lectures next summer. We'll again have a guest talk by one partner and one manager from PricewaterhouseCoopers, who are just doing projects on this all the time. CRR and CRD4 projects. Banks usually have too little capital. They fall under the regulation. They need to increase capital, and they ask consultants, how should we calculate capital? How should we calculate the risk positions? And what can we do to increase capital to meet the leverage ratio requirements of the CRR and CRD4? Yeah? So this is something consultants are concerned about right now. MA risk, MR risk, is something German. These are the Mindestanforderungen an das Risikomanagement, the minimum requirements on risk management, and they are laid out in paragraph 25a of the German Banking Act, 25a KWG. It requires that banks need to have proper business organization, meaning they need a proper risk management. Now, this to some extent is obsolete. First of all, any German stock company, according to, I think, 94 or 95 of the German Stock Act, ich meine 94 oder 95 des Aktiengesetzes, oder 98 kann auch sein, ich kenne die Paragraphen nicht. According to the German Stock Company Act, stock companies need to monitor all existence-threatening risks, and management needs to keep track of all bankruptcy of all risks that might lead to bankruptcy. Ja, das heißt da so schön, dass die Unternehmensführung alle existenzbedrohenden Risiken überwachen und kontrollieren muss. The result is that companies of a certain size and stock companies, Aktiengesellschaften and also GmbHs, they need to file a risk report as part of their annual report. Even if they only include the statement, in the last year, we did not see any threatening risks, any risks that could have endangered our company, full stop. And some companies do it exactly like this. We have no risks, full stop, that's the full risk report. Larger companies with higher risk exposure will write 10, 20, 30, maybe 50 pages just in their risk report. It's mandatory. They need to do this, and the certified public accountant has to look through it and certify the risk report. But the CPA doesn't supervise the company. So for a regular industrial stock company, it only needs to be truthful. The CPA will not tell the company, your risk management is good. He or she will only say, well, the report is accurate. That's okay. And when is this of any importance? If stockholders later on want to sue managers. And by accident, this happened after the financial crisis a lot. Managers of companies that went bankrupt during the financial crisis, especially banks, they obviously did a pretty bad job. And what stockholders later on tried was to file lawsuits against their former managers for not keeping track of risks and for not fulfilling their lawful duties as managers. Ja? Also das ist eher ein Fall hinterher für die Managerhaftung. Gerade in der Finanzmarktkrise haben das sehr viele Aktionäre oder Aktionärsvertreter hinterher versucht. Eine Bank ist pleite gegangen oder in Schieflage geraten und die Aktionäre haben danach auf Basis des Aktiengesetzes dann versucht, die Manager oder die Aufsichtsräte auch zu verklagen. Das ist die Managerhaftung, denn das Aktiengesetz schreibt vor, dass das Aufgabe der Geschäftsführung oder des Vorstandes ist, laut entsprechend Aktiengesetz geändert durch das Kontrakt, das Gesetz über die Kontrolle und Transparenz im Unternehmensbereich. Und wenn Sie Glück haben, können Sie dann den Manager verklagen. So if you're lucky, you will be able to sue your manager, your former manager, and who will pay? The D&O and Insurance. The Directors and Officers Liability Insurance, die Managerhaftpflichtversicherung. Ja, der Manager hat ja nichts. Im besten Fall hat er 50 Millionen verdient. Da kann er Ihnen 50 Millionen geben. Aber wenn er eine Bank mit ein paar Milliarden Bilanzsumme vor die Wand gefahren hat, dann bringt Ihnen das nichts viel. Also die 50 Millionen sind dann die berühmt-berüchtigten Peanuts. Also dann werden Sie die D&O-Versicherung in Anspruch nehmen. So, any stock company has to have some kind of risk management. With insurance companies and banks, actually, it's part of their core business model. They are in the business of transforming risk. So you would assume they need to have a risk management anyway, otherwise they would not be a very good bank or insurance company. So at some point, regulators stated, okay, we just want to print this out in our rules. Yes, you need risk management, that's trivial, but we will ask for a certain minimum standard your risk management has to fulfill. We are not telling you what to do, but we have a certain set of minimum requirements your risk management should fulfill. For example, can you think of some standards you would ask for? You should, for example, have a clear hierarchy and clear and transparent organization in risk management that is absolutely clear who is responsible for what. So an organizational structure that allows a proper functioning of risk management. What else? risk culture and risk appetite should be laid out. What is usually standard in these companies is also a risk management handbook. What is a risk management handbook? What does it look like? A risk management handbook is exactly that. It's a handbook. It's a tutorial. It's a manual, which is maybe a PDF file. For example, and this is how it all starts. If we are a company, the university, and we probably have this. If we now think if we are a company, we should have a risk management, and we do have risk management, then we will write down everything we have in our risk management process in a PDF as part of our risk management manual, our handbook, das Risikomanagement-Handbuch. So we'll start with our main goal in risk management is preventing bankruptcy-threatening risks and informing management of appropriate risk exposure and current risk exposure and what else we are looking for. And our ultimate goal is maximization of shareholder value, maybe. Then what else is in the risk management handbook? Organizational structure, responsibilities, Verantwortlichkeiten im Risikomanagement. Klar ausgeschrieben, wer ist wofür verantwortlich, wer hat was zu machen. Process organization, how risk management is included in maybe trading processes. Limits, limit systems, that's part of the risk management handbook. The toolbox of available instruments, that is laid out in the risk management handbook, and so on. So this is a first start, what the supervisor will ask for as a minimum requirement of risk management, the existence of a risk management manual, clear responsibilities, organizational structure and hierarchy in risk management, risk culture, risk appetite. And to be frank, I still have a problem with the term risk culture. Culture is a very ambiguous term. And this is actually how I got to meet this partner from PricewaterhouseCoopers, because he had a publication out that he is consulting banks on how to implement a good risk culture and risk management culture. This is quite an ambiguous topic. Wenn Sie mich fragen, sehr wischiwaschi. Ja, also Risikokultur. Was ist Risikokultur? Das Risikoappetit. Man ist bereit, so und so viel Risiko einzugehen oder so und so viel nicht. Es ist immer schwierig, das als Unternehmen vorzuschreiben. So these are some minimum requirements on your risk management. We have basically the same in insurance. Question for Euro. Does anyone know where this is included in insurance supervision in Germany? It is part of Solvency II. Solvency II, just like Basel II, is a set of regulations and some rules laid out by the Basel Committee, then included and voted on by the European Union. But if you know anything about how the European Union works and how European law works, it usually is that all the things that have been decided on at the European Union level needs to be incorporated into national law. So even if you know that the minimum requirements on risk management, the MA risk, came from Basel II and Solvency II, that is correct, but that's not the place where you can find it in German law. The MA risk for banking have been included in paragraph 25A of the German Banking Act. Where do you find it in insurance? Again, if I'm not very much mistaken, I think it's paragraph 45 VAG. Ich meine, gucken Sie es lieber nach, Paragraph 45 Versicherungsaufsichtsgesetz. Sie lachen. Haben Sie schon nachgeguckt? Nee? Okay. Kann auch 48 sein, aber ich meine aber irgendwas mit 40. Ist also in das Versicherungsaufsichtsgesetz eingeführt worden. And you have the same for insurance companies. So it's part of the German Act on Insurance Supervision, Versicherungsaufsichtsgesetz. General section of the MA risk, establishment of the overall responsibility of management for an appropriate business organization. That's the same actually as in the Contract and the Stock Company Act, meaning that in the end, it's the managers who are responsible for this. If risk management fails, management is responsible for this. Minimum requirements for risk management, organization, documentation, human and technical resources, activities in new markets, and outsourcing. And you have a special section, formulation of the requirements for the internal control system. That is something very, very peculiar. In German, how do you call this? There's a special name we have for this, the internal control system. That's the IKS, das interne Kontrollsystem. And this is something different from what you would think is an internal control system. What is your internal control system? It is basically internal revision, interne Revision. The internal control system is the part of risk management where it's basically about preventing fraud and preventing any illegal action. And for example, the internal control system is made up by, for example, a 4I principle, by installing backup systems and double checks when it comes to accounting. And this is the internal control system. Also verwechseln Sie, wenn Sie internes Kontrollsystem hören, IKS, das ist tatsächlich im Controlling und im Risikomanagement ein Fachbegriff für einen sehr kleinen Teilausschnitt des Risikomanagements. Und da geht es wirklich nur um sowas wie Vier-Augen-Prinzip, interne Revision, Absicherung und Kontrolle von Buchungen und Ähnlichem. Und das Vermeiden und das Verhindern von Betrug. Also klar, das ist Risikomanagement, aber das ist nicht auf der Abstraktions- und auf der Komplexitätsstufe, wie beispielsweise, ich handle da mit 3 ausgewählten Derivaten und sichere meine offene Position in Repo-Geschäften ab, sondern das eher, ich stelle sicher, dass mich keiner beklaut. Das ist also das interne Kontrollsystem. Das ist ein Teil des Risikomanagements, aber es ist nicht, ist schon ein bisschen was anderes. Und das hat jedes Unternehmen. Clear separation of functions, documentation and permanent monitoring of all trading and lending transactions, and so on and so on. This is all MA risk. Internal audit, interne Revision, closely related to the internal control system. Internal audit checks all activities and processes, risk-oriented audit planning, communication to the management, also whistleblowing and these things. That's internal audit. In German, we call this interne Revision or just short Revision. This is, I can give you one funny story here. I still remember this. Internal audit is pretty much what it sounds like. It is a section, a division of your company that is meant to be independent and that walks from division to division and checks whether everything's in order and everything checks out. And to give you an idea how this can be organized and with what intention, I still remember that one of my former colleagues, when I did my PhD, he started to work for a large holding company in Duisburg. I think in Duisburg. They at some point owned Metro and Real, some other large. It's a large company. No one knows this. At that time, they got a new CEO who came from Daimler. And the first thing he did was he installed a new internal audit section, and he named it Central Internal Audit, abbreviated CIA. Nomen est omen. So the intention for this internal audit division, you can guess from the name that this new section was given. And this is how usually employees will regard internal audit. If they show up, you have a problem. Yeah? And risk management suffers a little bit from this image and this reputation that comes with the internal audit function. Now, risk management might be done together with internal audit. It might be included or it could be separated. But the problem is, internal audit is usually something that only comes to you if something's not right and if something is off. Risk management is something that should be done every time you do business, and usually a risk manager should be in a supportive role, whereas internal audit is the whistleblower and the referee that will, in some cases, even punish you because you've done something wrong. But nevertheless, many business divisions and many employees will make no distinction. If they hear risk management, they will think, oh, here they come again. Here comes the risk manager who wants to prevent me from doing my business. Yeah? In practice, this is a huge problem. Risk managers being put into the same bin just like internal auditors. And yes, they sometimes do the same job, or internal audit is part of risk management, but risk management is usually much more business-oriented than internal audit. Okay. This is also part of what is now famously called ICAP, the International Capital Adequacy Assessment Process, ICAP. It's meant to calculate the overall risk profile, to determine the available risk coverage potential, to formulate a business strategy, to formulate a consistent risk strategy, to establish appropriate risk management and controlling processes. Okay, my pronunciation is suffering at this late hour. And to formulate a capital planning process. That's ICAP. All considerable and all relevant risks must be included in the determination of the overall risk profile. This includes counterparty risk, market price, business participation, reputation, and op risk. Banks have freedom regarding the methodology of risk quantification. You can use many different risk models. The requirements for stress tests have been upped by Basel III, and extraordinary but plausible possible events have to be shown. Stress tests. We haven't talked about stress tests, also part of capital adequacy regulation of ICAP and Basel III. Very simply, you have some scenarios, you come up with scenarios, and you look at your risk profile and your capital adequacy under different risk stress scenarios. So if everything goes down the drain, how will my bank capital look like tomorrow? Okay. Basel I, Basel III in more detail. Basel I started in 1988. Target group at that point were internationally active banks. So we started out with the large ones. And the implementation of Basel I was carried out into European law by the second Banking Law Coordination Directive. Again, European law, European Union law works like this. The Commission and Parliament pass a directive, which has then to be, my English is failing me now. It has then to be implemented into national law. Just like the minimum requirements on risk management have entered the German Banking Act and the German Insurance Supervision Act, same happened here. So regulations became legally binding for all credit institutions, and the objectives were reducing distortions of competition, strengthening the credit worthiness and stability of the international banking system. One has to keep in mind when this was passed, in the 80s. At that point, we hadn't seen a banking crisis at a global level for 50 years. So we didn't really care too much about systemic risk, and it was all about creating a level playing ground for European banks within the European Union. We didn't have online banking. I'm not sure if we already had the Schengen system, so we probably still had border controls. but we wanted to standardize and harmonize the European banking sector, and it was mainly about reducing frictions to competition within the European Union. And we only had German banks in Germany at that time, for example. So capital resources looked like this. They were subject to minimum capital requirements, and the assets were divided into 4 risk weight classes. 0% loans to OECD countries, meaning what? No risk, no weight. 20% loans to banks based in OECD countries, that's okay. 50%, for example, mortgage-backed real estate loans, and 100% everything else. So you can already see, you use different risk weight classes to risk weight your assets, and risks and assets that are considered to be risk-free enter with 0%, and high-risk exposure assets enter with 100%. And banks must have a minimum equity base of 8% of their risk-weighted assets. And here, by the way, you can see the famous, infamous 8%. You have to have 8% capital. It doesn't tell you what you actually have in equity, it's regulatory capital, 8% regulatory capital. So, capital backing is calculated. Capital backing has to equal credit amount times percentage of risk class times 8%. And you can probably guess where it goes from here. Under Basel II, they changed the laws and the rules for which you calculate the capital. They changed the risk weights, and what did enter? Valued risk. That you could use valued risk for calculating the risk exposure. Liable equity, core capital and supplementary capital. In German, Kernkapital, Ergänzungskapital. Supplementary capital may make up a maximum of 50% of liable equity, and core capital is tier 1. It's available for an indefinite period and cannot be repaid at creditors initiative. Tier 2 capital is supplementary capital, Ergänzungskapital, also includes long-term subordinated liabilities. Das ist der klassische Fall, wo üblicherweise Studenten durcheinander kommen. Das nennt sich Kapital, ist aber eine Verbindlichkeit. Nachrangige Verbindlichkeiten gingen zum Teil damals ein, immer noch heute, aber damals ganz typisch, ein in das Ergänzungskapital. Und deswegen ist Eigenkapital immer ungleich regulatorisches Kapital. Das regulatorische Kapital ist größer, weil das Fremdkapital Bestandteile mit aufnimmt. Denn die Idee ist letztlich the idea is the following. In case of bankruptcy, your equity to cover losses, and you might use some type of debt which is subordinated because it doesn't give preferential treatment and has to be paid out first in case of bankruptcy. So if it has to be paid out last, it's close to equity, and you can include it with, say, 50% in regulatory capital. That is why regulatory capital includes not just core tier 1 capital, but also debt. Tier 1 capital, you can usually see it abbreviated. How? Core tier 1 capital, CT1 capital. If you ever see this in a research paper or a balance sheet. Okay. Expansion of the bank's derivatives and trading business led the Basel Committee to publish a recommendation on measuring and backing risk in 96. 98, this was translated into German law, includes the specification of quotas and standard measurement procedures to back specific risk and general market risk. However, the use of bank internal models on the presentation of a permission by the competent supervisory authority is possible. That's a weird translation on the slide. What is meant by this very clumsy translation from German to English is regulators at this point, in the middle of the 90s, especially in Basel II, they started to allow internal models What is meant by an internal model? Regulators shifted from a system where they stipulated a set of rules, saying, for example, you have to use this model, 8%, to a model and a system, a framework where they said, you can choose. Use our model, which is very conservative, and you will have very high capital under our standard model, or you use an internal model, but you have to get our permission and you have to lay out the mechanics and the details of this internal model to us, to supervisors. We will allow it, we'll give you a permit, and then if you convince us, supervisors, that your internal model is better than our standard model, you are allowed to use your internal model. And this has been included in insurance supervision and banking supervision back from the mid-90s up until now. You will always find a standard model, a standard formula, and an internal model, an internal approach, or very famously, does anyone know how it's called in Basel II, in credit risk? The IRB approach, the internal ratings-based approach. It means that in credit risk modeling and credit risk management, you can use the standard formula, or you can use an internal model that is based on your internal ratings for an internal measurement of credit risk of your lenders. If you have a better model, you use your own internal ratings-based approach. If you use the standard formula, you will probably end up with higher capital. What is the idea of supervisors behind that? Supervisors are aware that usually you as a bank, should know your business better than any supervisor. So there is an incentive. You can either use the standard approach, which is very costly in terms of capital, but the supervisor can lay back and say, well, I'm done. It's not 8%, it's 12% capital, we are safe. Or the bank has to spend money to come up with an internal model that is supposed to be more realistic. The supervisor can still check the validity of the internal model. And if the supervisor says, well, this looks okay to us, the bank has an incentive, or the financial institution, insurers can do the same. The financial institution has an incentive to come up with a more sophisticated internal model, and they will be rewarded in the sense that they can lower their required capital. This is what is nowadays done since Basel II. You always have a standard formula and an internal model. Same in Solvency II. With Solvency II, however, it was quite funny to see what happened. I think it has now changed. But does anyone know what happened in insurance after the introduction of Solvency II? They also had a standard formula and an internal model approach. The internal model approach, however, was so complicated and the burden was so high on insurance, only one insurer used an internal model. Does anyone know which? But it's probably not Leipziger, Allianz. Allianz was because Allianz by far is the largest insurance company in Germany, in Europe actually. Only Allianz used an internal model. Every other insurer said, no, let's just take the standard formula. Let's accept the fact that we have higher capital requirements. Before we start using an internal model, we'll spend so much money with consultants and so much money internally on coming up with such a model. Let's just use the standard approach. This is, I think I heard this has changed now, but at the start of Solvency II, no insurer besides Allianz opted for the internal model, because it was so complicated and costly. And market price risk, well, we already know this. Okay. Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 capital. What's Tier 3 capital? Tier 3 capital consists of net profits from fictitious offsetting of the trading book and short-term subordinate liabilities. These may only be used to back market price risk. So yet Tier 1, Tier 2 and Tier 3 capital, 3 layers of capital in Basel I. Basel Committee determines deductions and correction items. As you can imagine, the system, even under Basel I, was very complicated to come up with all those capital figures and the risk exposure. Let's concentrate on the critique. Very low number of risk classes and risk weight classes. It didn't consider debtors' credit worthiness. Capital requirements do not sufficiently reflect credit risk, as they are not differentiated very much, and it focused exclusively on capital requirements, on credit and market risk. This criticism led to the adoption of Basel II in the mid-90s. Basel II is famous for what? First of all, for differentiating now credit risk, market risk, and operational risk. Op risk came into existence as a term with the Basel II. And if you nowadays ask a banker or an insurance risk manager, what risk types do you have? You will always hear credit, market, op risk. It's always 3 bins. And the second thing, Basel II and subsequently Solvency II is famous for, because Solvency II is basically Basel II for insurance companies, more or less, with 10 years difference in time. The other thing Basel II is famous for are the 3 pillars, die 3 Säulen in Basel II. The 3 pillars. And before I stop, I want to show you these 3 pillars. First one, minimum requirements on capital. Second pillar, the banking supervision process, how supervision is done, how it's unified. And the third one is increased transparency and market discipline. Especially the third pillar is usually referred to as market discipline. Why is it market discipline? Why? Who do you want to discipline? Was meinen Sie denn mit Marktdisziplin in diesem Kontext? Durch erweiterte Offenlegungspflichten. Increased disclosure means more transparency. More transparency means that Bank A can better see what Bank B is doing in their risk management. And the idea of regulators was they wanted to force banks to converge in a market process at a high standard level of what they do in risk management and and bank management. So the idea was that by increasing disclosure rules and increasing market transparency, I'm Bank A, I can see that Bank B is doing much more in risk management, and that I have the impression I need to do more in risk management as well, because at some point supervisors will force me to do, or it might be that you are actually profiting from a better risk management. So the idea was incentivize banks to do a better risk management by showing banks what other banks do, by increasing market transparency. Das ist die Marktdisziplinierung und die erweiterten Offenlegungspflichten hier in der 3. Säule von Basel II. Das gleiche kennen wir bei Solvency II. Säule 1 sind die Kapitalanforderungen und Säule 2 ist der bankaufsichtsrechtliche Überwachungsprozess. Und damit inbegriffen sind natürlich auch die entsprechenden Regeln, wie das Risiko auszurechnen ist. Man spricht dann auch gerne immer von der quantitativen Säule, von der Marktdisziplinsäule und von der qualitativen Säule. Qualitativ, switch back to English, quantitative pillar, the quant pillar is what? That's the first one where you have the quantitative rules, how to calculate risk and how to calculate capital. That's quantitative stuff. The second one is qualitative, the qualitative pillar. Why? Because it tells you what your risk management has to look like and how what supervision looks for. It looks for the quality, not the numbers, what the quality of the risk management process. And the third one is market discipline. Increased transparency, increased disclosure rules, and that's Basel II. Standardized approach, IRB, Pillar 1, standardized approach. We'll talk about this in detail more. And then you see the qualitative requirements and the disclosure requirements. That's Basel II. We'll talk about this in detail next. And do you have any questions? And my final word is this. Basel II is, let's hope no one from our insurance department hears this, Solvency II, in essence, is Basel II converted for the insurance sector. Of course, it's completely different because you have actuarial risks, you have different capital, you have a completely different business model, but the structure, the layout is the same. You have a quantitative pillar that is solvency, CSR, SCR, and MCR, minimum capital requirement and solvency capital requirements, basically something similar to Pillar 1 in Basel II. You have qualitative pillar, that is the supervisory process, and you have increased transparency rules. This is no coincidence because the insurance regulators thought, well, the bankers have done Basel II, then let's renew and let's make insurance supervision great again. Let's do the same in insurance. Problem is, they came up with Solvency II, but it took them almost 10 to 15 years longer to install it in the insurance sector. And Solvency II has only become law 2 years ago. And the insurance companies have a lot of rules in place for guiding them slowly towards the new capital requirements. Also Solvency II hat ewig gebraucht bei der Einführung. Das lag daran, dass das Versicherungsgeschäft ist natürlich auch hochkomplex und das wurde ganz behutsam, wurde das mit sogenannten Quantitative Impact Studies getestet, geschaut, was hätte das für Auswirkungen. Die Versicherungsbranche hat sich lange sehr erfolgreich dagegen gewehrt. Dann ist es irgendwann eingeführt worden und es gibt wahnsinnige Übergangsfristen. Also Sie können sehr viele Ausnahmsklauseln in Anspruch nehmen und das Schöne und Lustige ist, wenn die Versicherungen alle sich heute an Solvency II halten müssten, wären sie alle pleite. Ja, also die Kapitalanforderungen können, als es eingeführt wurde, hätte das keiner eingehalten. Und deswegen gibt es da über 20, 30 Jahre so Ausnahmeklauseln, dass sie im Grunde genommen 30 Jahre Zeit haben, um so langsam ansteigend ihre Kapitalanforderungen erfüllen zu können, weil auch die Regulierer wissen, das wäre alles sonst nicht einzuhalten. Also Solvency II ist ein Thema für sich, aber die Struktur ähnelt exakt der von Basel II und da ist die Versicherungsbranche einfach ein bisschen hinterher. Aber die haben natürlich auch Solvency II unter den Aspekten und den Erfahrungen der Finanzmarktkrise entsprechend weiterentwickelt. Gut, wenn Sie sonst keine Fragen erstmal haben, if you don't have any further questions, thank you for your attention and see you next week.